The town of Hollow Creek was small, peaceful, and tucked between endless fields of corn and oak trees. People knew each other by name, and Sunday mornings were sacred. At the center of it all stood the House of Grace, a modest wooden church that had been built nearly 50 years ago. Its worn pews, faded hymnal books, and cracked bell carried the history of countless baptisms, weddings, and tearful prayers. Pastor Elias Ward, a man in his late 40s with calm eyes and a steady voice, had led that church for over a decade. He wasn't a loud preacher or a man seeking recognition. He believed in the power of quiet faith, in small acts of kindness and forgiveness. For the people of Hollow Creek, Elias wasn't just a pastor, he was family. But on a cold November night, everything changed. A soft wind carried the faint smell of smoke across town, and by the time the first alarm was raised, flames were already devouring the church's roof. The fire moved fast, too fast to be natural. Neighbors rushed to help, forming a desperate line with buckets of water, but it was no use. The entire structure was engulfed in a roaring inferno that painted the night sky orange. Elias arrived just as the steeple collapsed. He froze, watching helplessly as his life's work turned to ashes. The wooden cross above the altar burned last, glowing bright against the black smoke before falling into the flames. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of burning wood and the faint wail of the fire engine siren. When the firefighters finally put out the blaze, only the church's stone foundation remained. A few hours later, Fire Chief Dalton approached Elias with a grim look. "Pastor, this wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "We found traces of gasoline. Someone set this fire on purpose." The words hit harder than the flames ever could. Who would do something like this, and why? The next morning, reporters gathered around the ruins. A journalist asked Elias if he felt defeated. Elias looked at the smoldering remains, then turned to her with quiet conviction. "Faith doesn't burn that easily," he said. But that night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the smell of smoke still lingering in his clothes, one haunting question echoed in his mind. Who would hate enough to burn the House of Grace? He didn't know it yet, but the fire was only the beginning. In the days following the fire, Pastor Elias Ward tried to convince himself that the worst was over. The church could be rebuilt, walls, wood, and glass could all be replaced. But what couldn't be repaired was the growing sense of fear that began to creep through Hollow Creek. The townspeople, once warm and friendly, now avoided eye contact. Some whispered that maybe the fire was a warning. Others claimed it was God's will. But Elias knew better. This was malice, not divine intervention. A week after the tragedy, the first anonymous letter arrived. It was slipped under the door of Elias' small parsonage home. The handwriting was jagged and angry. "Leave Hollow Creek, preacher. The ashes are just the beginning." Elias' hands trembled as he read the note. He folded it neatly, placed it inside his Bible, and told no one. But the next morning he found another letter, this time pinned to his fence with a knife. It said, "You were warned." He contacted Detective Sarah Klein, a calm but determined investigator from the county sheriff's office. She was in her early 30s, sharp-minded and skeptical of superstition. When Elias showed her the letters, she frowned. "This isn't random vandalism," she said. "Someone wants you gone, and they're not done yet." Sarah began asking around town, quietly visiting local shops and diners. Most people acted nervous. Nobody wanted to talk. But one store clerk mentioned something strange. A group of men had been meeting late at night in the old lumber yard on the outskirts of town. They called themselves the Pure Flame Brotherhood, a local extremist group that despised Elias' open preaching and his message of acceptance. Elias had heard whispers of them before, men who believed only certain people deserved salvation. They had vandalized other churches in nearby towns but were never caught. Then came the second attack. Late one night, Elias awoke to a loud bang outside his window. When he ran outside, his car was engulfed in flames. The orange light flickered across his front porch, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow watching from across the street. The next morning, another note appeared on his doorstep. "You should have left when you had the chance." Fear began to settle deep inside Elias' heart. Yet instead of fleeing, he did something unexpected. He walked to the ruins of his burned church, planted a small wooden cross in the ashes, and whispered, "If they burn this one, I'll build another." It was the first quiet act of defiance in what would become a battle between faith and hate. Detective Sarah Klein worked tirelessly through the following weeks, determined to find out who had targeted Pastor Elias Ward. Every lead seemed to fade into smoke, until she received the fire investigation report. The accelerant used to burn the church wasn't common gasoline. It was an industrial-grade chemical used only in lumber processing. That detail changed everything. There was only one place in Hollow Creek that could have supplied it: Hollow Creek Timber Works, the town's largest employer. The company was owned by Mark Ridley, a man as powerful as he was feared. Ridley wasn't just a businessman, he was the kind of man who believed his wealth gave him authority over everything, including morality. He had been vocal about his dislike of Elias' preaching, calling him a troublemaker for welcoming people from all backgrounds into the church. When Sarah visited Ridley's office, the atmosphere was tense, the smell of sawdust mixed with arrogance. Ridley leaned back in his leather chair, smirking as she asked about the fire. "You think I burned down a church," he said. "That place was a stain on this town, but fire, that's a bit dramatic even for me." His words chilled her. He wasn't denying his hatred, only the crime. Sarah noticed a burn on his right hand, partially hidden under his cuff. Coincidence? Maybe. But she left his office with a gnawing sense that he knew more than he admitted. That night, Elias received a visit from his longtime friend and caretaker, Daniel Moore, a quiet, loyal man who had helped maintain the church for years. Daniel looked pale and nervous. "Elias," he said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." He confessed that months before the fire, Mark Ridley had approached him with an offer $10,000 if he could persuade Elias to leave Hollow Creek quietly. Daniel refused, but ever since, he had been followed and threatened. He hadn't told anyone because he feared for his life. Elias felt his chest tighten. The pieces were falling into place. The fire, the threats, the hatred all tied back to Ridley. But as Elias prayed that night, another discovery awaited him. While sorting through the few saved church documents, he found an old deed signed by Ridley's own grandfather. It revealed that the land where the church stood had been donated under one condition: it would remain a place of worship forever. Destroying it wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of his family's legacy. And Elias knew then Mark Ridley wasn't just fighting him. He was fighting his own bloodline. Despite the fear, the sleepless nights, and the constant threats, Pastor Elias Ward refused to abandon his calling. The house of grace was gone, but the faith that built it still lived in the people's hearts. So, on a chilly Sunday morning, Elias made a bold decision. He would hold a public outdoor service right on the ashes of the burned church. Word spread quickly through Hollow Creek. Some warned him it was too dangerous, that he was provoking whoever had set the fires. But Elias only smiled. "Faith isn't real until it's tested," he said. "If they see we're not afraid, the darkness loses its power." When the day came, over 50 people showed up: families, old friends, and even strangers from neighboring towns who had heard about the tragedy. The smell of burned wood still lingered in the air, but that morning, sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the ruins. People stood close together, holding hands, singing hymns that trembled with both sorrow and hope. Elias stepped onto a small platform made from broken planks of the old church floor. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "They burned our building," he said, "but not our belief. They can't burn the truth that lives inside us." Just as he finished those words, the sound of an engine echoed from the hill above. A pickup truck came speeding down the dirt road toward the crowd. Someone in the back stood up, and before anyone could react, they hurled a Molotov cocktail toward the people gathered below. For one terrifying second, time froze. The bottle hit the ground just feet away from the congregation. But instead of exploding, it landed in a puddle of leftover rainwater from the night before, and the fire went out instantly. A wave of gasps swept through the crowd. Even the attacker seemed stunned. The truck screeched away, disappearing into the distance. Elias looked down at the smoking bottle, then raised his head toward the crowd. "You see," he said softly, "no weapon formed against us shall prosper." That night, Detective Sarah Klein traced the truck to one of Mark Ridley's employees. With that lead, she secured a warrant and searched the Hollow Creek Timberworks yard. There, hidden behind stacks of wood, she found gasoline cans, blueprints, and a list of targets. At the top of the list, Elias Ward. It was all the proof she needed. Mark Ridley was finally arrested, and the truth about the fires, the threats, and the hate behind them began to unfold. But for Elias, the miracle wasn't just that the bottle didn't explode. It was that fear had lost its grip on the people of Hollow Creek. Months passed after Mark Ridley's arrest, and Hollow Creek began to heal. The burned remains of the House of Grace no longer felt cursed. They felt sacred, like the ground itself had absorbed the prayers of the faithful. Where once there had been blackened debris, now wildflowers began to bloom through the cracks. It was as if nature itself wanted to help rebuild what hate had destroyed. Pastor Elias Ward refused to let the tragedy define the town. With quiet determination, he organized meetings, gathered donations, and inspired volunteers from all over the county. People who had never even met him sent money, supplies, and handwritten letters filled with encouragement. Former rivals worked side by side, hammering nails and laying new foundations. The same hands that once trembled in fear now built in faith. Even Daniel Moore, still haunted by the guilt of staying silent for too long, became one of the most dedicated workers. "I can't change what happened," he told Elias, "but I can help rebuild what we lost." Elias smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not rebuilding for me," he said. "You're rebuilding for all of us." After months of labor, the new church stood proudly on the old foundation, stronger, brighter, and filled with hope. Its steeple rose higher than before, and sunlight poured through new stained glass windows that told the story of Hollow Creek's darkest night and its miraculous dawn. On the day of the reopening, hundreds gathered from nearby towns. Reporters filmed the ceremony, but Elias ignored the cameras. He stood before his people holding a small, charred cross, the only thing that had survived the original fire. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "They burned our church," he said, "thinking they could end what we stood for. But faith doesn't die in flames. It rises brighter than before." As the choir sang, the bell rang for the first time in a year, echoing across the fields. Tears flowed freely, not from sorrow but from gratitude. A week later, Elias received a letter from Mark Ridley, written from his prison cell. "Your faith ruined my plans," it read, "but it saved my soul." Elias folded the letter gently, placed it beside his Bible, and looked toward the new church glowing under the afternoon sun. It was proof of a truth he had always believed. You can burn a building, but you can never destroy belief.